Okay, welcome everybody to our second of our NSR seminar series. Today we welcome Professor Louise Mansfield from Brunel University, UK. Louise has been leading a project that I've been working on with her for the last 3 years, looking at what works for wellbeing. And she'll tell you more about that programme. It's been a fascinating programme, not just in terms of evidence reviews, but also in terms of stakeholder engagement, which has been really complex in the project, and that's what Louise's workshop tomorrow is going to be about. So today she's going to be focusing on the programme and research, and tomorrow she's going to be looking at how to engage multiple stakeholders, including policymakers, practitioners and members of the public, which is an increasing requirement for us academics. So Louise has got some really valuable experience in this area. So I'll hand over to Louise.
Kiitos. That's my only English word that I learned yesterday. But thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm wandering around in a state of excitement, as you do when you go to a new country. But I'm going to talk about the project that Norma was introducing there. Please interject if you want to ask questions as we go along, or do so at the end. And just to put this into a bit more context, like Norma said, we've been working on this project for 3 years now, since 2015. I guess the impetus for it came from UK government policy, and in 2010 there was a public consultation in the UK on what wellbeing meant to people. And since then we've very much moved from GDP as a measure of wellbeing, which is clearly very narrow, to trying to look at much more complex understandings of wellbeing in people's lives. So that's the kind of government policy context for this. And as a development of that, there was a need to look at the evidence base, build the evidence base, and that's where we've been positioned since 2015. We've particularly looked at culture and sport, which is a big funded government sector in the UK, but there are overlapping evidence programmes, one on work and learning, one on communities, and then a cross-cutting methods work stream, which has been really fascinating, because not only is it a tricky question about what is well-being, but then the question about how do you measure well-being or evaluate it is been central to the work. The project is led by Christina Victor at Brunel University, and her actual expertise is around loneliness, and loneliness has come back in at the end of the 3 years as a key concept that we need to understand better, and a driver for well-being and or a threat to well-being. So I think it's quite interesting, the development of evidence and the link to impact, and how long that takes. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. I'm going to do 4 overlapping things in this presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the evidence programme, what we've tried to do, the aims and objectives, and how we've done it. I'm going to focus on the partnership working, and particularly look at the key successes that we've had in there, but also the challenges, because that's quite a complex part of the programme. So what was this all about? Like I said, it was positioned within UK government policy, focused on trying to explore the complexities of wellbeing after public consultation. But our programme is about developing evidence. So the methods that we've used so far are evidence review methods, from traditional systematic reviews to perhaps more complicated ones that are based on qualitative research. And of course, then that brings into question what counts as evidence. And we've asked ourselves that, I think, every single day. But it was about collecting and collating evidence. It was about using high standard established operating procedures to do that. And quite a key part of that was not just about collecting the evidence and publishing it in academic journals, although we have done that. It's about then saying, well, who is this for? How can it be used by a range of audiences? And that has got us very much into this idea of translating evidence, but also disseminating it, mobilising it, and really focusing on producing useful and usable evidence for a range of audiences. And you can start to think then, how to do that, how complex is that? And that's been, for me, a really fascinating part of the project, but also a challenge, because when I get to talk a little bit more about the partnerships, they are really broad ranging, from policymakers to public groups, and working with those, and also building capacity within our universities for what we're rightly or wrongly calling wellbeing science, is actually really, really important. And we've tried to do that through a number of means, in terms of our master's programmes, doctoral training programmes, and so on and so forth. So you can see that those 3 kind of core aims themselves develop quite a complex network of issues to work through. We're part of, and have been from the start, the UK What Works Centre for Wellbeing. There are a number of What Works centres in the UK, 7 of them. They're all about developing rigorous evidence for a particular policy. Some of them are in health, some of them are in early learning. There's a whole range of them. And this one sits within that network. And I think that this description that they use, an independent collaborative organisation set up to develop and share robust, accessible and useful evidence about wellbeing, really does kind of capture what they're trying to do. It is about developing rigorous evidence, but credible evidence. And in the wellbeing sector, that evidence is really, really broad, and we can talk about that a little bit more. I mean, one of the, I'll start to talk about the partnerships. Along the bottom there, you've got a whole series of universities across the UK that are involved. Now, Norma's here. We've got the University of Tampere is clearly a partner in what we've been doing in the later stages, and we've got a bid in for another year's project that will involve Norma, the UK government, all sorts of commercial networks, public, private, third sector partnerships are involved in this. And even in our programme, and I'll talk about how we develop this network, there are more than 55 stakeholders in the project, just in culture and sport. And so it really is about not just focusing on the evidence, but who the evidence is for and how you use that and how you share it. So the way we've informed what that centre does comes from those broad aims about building evidence. The collaborations are really multidisciplinary. On our team, we've got social scientists, economists, we've got people who are specialists in public health and in policy studies. Again, really vibrant kind of community to build on that evidence. Part of what we are trying to do is also ensuring evidence quality. We've developed a methods guide in the centre, which I've informed and Norma has informed, to ensure high standards, but to be really flexible about the type of evidence that goes in there. Traditionally, the systematic review is all about quantitative meta-analysis, and there are standards for doing that. There's some also not very good quantitative work, and we need to be able to judge that. And similarly, the importance of qualitative research has been central to what we're doing, but we need to be able to judge that in terms of its quality in order to produce credible evidence at the end. And I think the partnerships are really about influencing and making a difference to the well-being of the UK population, and whether you're putting that into a country context or looking at it worldwide on a global scale. I think that notion of making a difference is really important with the evidence. Often evidence that we produce can sit in journal articles that people don't access, or the people who need them don't access. And that's something we've really tried to challenge in order to, and I think that being in partnership with the What Works Centre has been really valuable for that, because a lot of the translation and dissemination and the production of outputs has been led by them. And in higher education, that's obviously quite difficult for us to do in terms of resources and cost and skills. So that partnership's been really, really valuable, and that's how we've informed their work. So I said I'd talk about partnerships, and I will, because that has been really central to this project. It's actually a key feature of my own work. My background's in sociology, but my methods are broadly ethnographic. So being involved with communities, particularly around the development of physical activity and inclusive approaches, is central to my work. And I know it is for Norma in culture, and particularly the arts. So partnerships was something that really drew me to this project. In the UK, I don't know what it's like here, but health and wellbeing work is driven by partnership approaches. You see it in policy strategy, you see it in research strategies. Some authors have argued we've got partnership-itis. It's the go-to mechanism for doing any work. And actually, for us, we think the partnerships are really important, but thinking about what those partnerships are.
I'm just gonna, it's not for
yeah.
it's somebody was trying to join.
Okay.
I think as they.
Where is it? It's that green one there, I think.
Okay.
No, it doesn't.
Away.
Sorry.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. Lovely. But right from the outset, and in our bid, we used a particular model of partnerships in order to drive the work. And there's lots of theories about partnerships, partners are sometimes called stakeholders or groups, or there's lots of words for it. I mean, I particularly like the theories that focus on partnerships as a process, as an iterative approach to knowledge exchange. And I think that is kind of underpinned what we've done. There's all sorts of models for them, but I think that as a fundamental way of knowledge exchange has been critical. And I've written more recently around what I've called the 3 R's of partnership working, and that involves reciprocity, resourcefulness, and reflexivity. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But I think focusing on the processes of partnership is probably the best way for us to ensure that they work effectively. That doesn't mean they're perfect, they're not, and they do go wrong. But I think, you know, that reflection, for example, is really structured in our programme to try and think about the things that are not working for people and address them at the time that they occur, or even try and predict them. It's always really difficult. But that's really our kind of broad approach to the partnership working. And from the start, again, there's lots of models of stakeholder engagement, co-design, end user workshops, all of that kind of stuff in different disciplines, actually. And it's been fascinating working across disciplines to see how different perspectives are used and how actually there's some similarity between them. From the start, we had this model. We categorized our partners into these categories: policymakers, commissioners and managers, scholars and fellows, and that's academic scholars, but also you find there's scholars working outside of the academy that are really expert and have been involved in our project, public and citizen groups, professional practitioners, and then the evidence programmes and the What Works Centre, and us kind of sitting in the middle. So that was our model. We drew that from another What Works Centre, NICE, National Institute for Clinical Excellence. It's changed its name. Yeah. And we found that really valuable. Someone once asked me, you know, how do you select your stakeholders? And I don't think that's necessarily the way we've worked. We've activated networks that we've had for a very long time, Norma in culture, myself in sport, and other people in public health. And again, coming back to that definition of it being an iterative process, we have tried to get our message out there, connect with people, and continue that going. And sometimes partners leave and others come in. But that's been the process. But I think it's been valuable to have this model as a starting point, because it's allowed us to think, who do we need to connect with, who might want to know what we're doing, and where can we draw in expertise from across the board. Some of these are more difficult to engage with than others, based on networks, resources, of time and ability to commit. And we can, you know, I can talk about some of that at the end. So our first, I guess, focus for using the partnerships was to actually determine the evidence reviews, the topics. Wellbeing is broad, it's defined differently in all the sectors. We had our own ideas about what was important to us from a research point of view, but we knew that other groups would have other ideas about what wellbeing was, how they were building wellbeing in, and how they were evaluating wellbeing. So right from the start, we were lucky on this project because there was a 6-month collaborative development phase built into it and funded. You hardly ever get that. And it was really valuable for us because it allowed us to do some work around determining our priority evidence reviews. So we had a series of workshops over 2 days for all of those particular groups. We also went out to the public groups who were delivering, whether that was music or arts programs or physical activity programs, whatever they were. Because one of the challenges of public and citizens groups is them having the time and the resources to come to a workshop at a university. And actually more valuable, I think, and you can never go to all of them, but more valuable is going out and getting out and seeing what people are doing. And there's all sorts of issues around the funding and the resourcing of that. But that was our approach, and really central to engaging all of the groups in the partnership model that we were using. So what we did with the workshops was that we asked them 2, I guess, key questions. And the project was underpinned by a particular definition of wellbeing, which the UK government was using from the back of that consultation work and development of the measure that they had in place since 2010. And it was a definition of subjective wellbeing. And quite simply, subjective wellbeing is defined by the Office of National Statistics in the UK as how well we're doing as individuals, communities and nations. And I quite like that, but of course it's a bit of a headache if you want to measure it. And so what has developed from there is a measure, a questionnaire, 4 dimensions to it, each answered on a Likert scale from 0 to 10, 0 being the worst and 10 being the best. And those questions are about life satisfaction, they're about anxiety, they're about happiness, and they're about worthwhileness. And I mean, I'm a qualitative researcher, so asking questions like that on a questionnaire always makes me a little bit nervous. But when you look at the research that's underpinned it, I can see where they were going. And you're in this kind of difficult situation, aren't you? How do you get a population approach to understanding well-being versus an in-depth approach about the real lives of people? And I think you can probably do it with those 2 methods, as limited as both of them are. But we wanted to ask our stakeholders what they thought about this definition of subjective well-being. So that was one of the key features of the workshop. We presented it to them. We asked them what they thought. We wanted them to identify what the domains were, because if we were looking for evidence, we needed to make sure that the domains we were looking at were relevant to the sectors. We asked them to think about what counts as evidence of well-being as well. And that, these were fascinating in terms of the breadth, and that was really supportive of how we were thinking about it. And that helped us to develop this shared evidence program over 3 years. We couldn't do everything. You can see how we also developed a Delphi, from Norma's expertise actually, a Delphi consultation with this group. So they had the workshops, we identified the core themes, we then sent back 2, having said I don't like questionnaires, we sent back 2 questionnaires to them to prioritise what they'd said to us in these workshops and these interviews. And it resulted in 4 priority topics. Music and singing across the life course, sport, dance and wellbeing for young people. In the UK, young people at that time were a key priority population for government agencies like Sport England. Since then, actually, the age range that they target has spread. Visual arts and wellbeing for those living with mental health conditions, and outdoor physical activity and wellbeing for families. So you can see we had a topic and a population group and a context that we were driving towards. And those have been the topics across the 4 years. That is what we've looked at. Of course, one of the challenges when you do a workshop and then 3 years later you do your outdoor physical activity review is whether or not that's still current. And I think we haven't gone back and asked them, and that might have been valuable to do, something we might build into another project. So we defined our evidence programs with our partners, and that then led to a partnership approach for generating the evidence. So I said this was an evidence review program. Each one of these topics came with that method. Like I said, we had a methods guide to guide us on the particular criteria that we use for developing the questions and the protocol, if you like, of that review. But broadly speaking, we were trying to look at outcomes in the evidence, and we were trying to look at the processes by which those outcomes were achieved. And it included the systematic review. We also used grey literature, which is unpublished literature. People may or may not be aware. But if you just limit to particularly in these sectors and on wellbeing, if you just limit to the published evidence, you're going to miss a whole range of unpublished evidence that is often very good or can be very good, and it's written by experts in the sector. So evaluation documents, reports. If you are looking at the performing arts, you might want to think about whether a performance piece is a piece of evidence. We haven't included any of that, but we might do in this next project that we want to do. And then how do you judge that in terms of its quality is another thing. Our partners at the London School of Economics, who are expert in the methods, also did secondary analysis on each topic of large-scale data sets that allowed us to answer those questions. So that came as a package. But also, again, through our partnership approaches, we produced case studies with sector delivery groups. And those are 2-page PDFs with pictures written in a language that the sector, that relates to the sector, rather than in a kind of academic jargon-laden language, to demonstrate what they're doing. And of course, this then has led us into not just building the evidence, but thinking about how we can advance the evidence and support the sector to do it. Because in a lot of these cases, the evidence is quite limited, even where it's very good. There isn't that, sometimes there wasn't that much going on. So the findings you can read, and in terms of dissemination, we of course have to publish in academic journals. We're all kind of under pressure to do that. And so with each of these kind of packages, we have sought to publish in academic journals. So there's one on music and singing, there's one on the Delphi questionnaire. And this is the sport and dance one. Again, you can find that now in the British Medical Journal, open. That's been just accepted and published. But what we've also tried to do, and we've worked very closely with the centre on this because that's a key feature of their work, is to translate these, what end up as academic papers, into lay briefings. And they look fantastic. And I don't think we could have ever made them look so amazing. I'll put the website up. If you want to have a look, you can look at the sheer range of things. So each one of the academic papers has a secondary analysis report that sits behind a briefing like this that is much more widely accessible to people, and then they can go to the academic report or the paper if they want to. All of the papers are open access as well. And this is a really kind of, in a really beneficial way of also extending the partnerships and the reach and scope of the project. And I think the other thing that we're trying to develop, which is quite challenging, is perhaps more visual, certainly underpinned by evidence, but a way of mapping out the processes. When I said in each of our review questions we're looking at outcomes and processes, actually the process is quite difficult to determine in the academic publications, because the publication, as you know, the way we publish is normally you publish a paper on outcomes, but you can't publish a qualitative with that. That goes somewhere else. If it goes at all, it depends on the nature of the research design. And so the very good qualitative published material and the very good grey literature, where we can, we're trying to produce these process maps because these are so valuable to people who are delivering and implementing projects on wellbeing or anything else. And we've built this into our next project. So we've done it with the visual arts one. And the latest one that's out, that's one of the secondary analysis, is the one on outdoor physical activity and wellbeing for families. And here we've also started to get in some kind of deeper conceptual stuff, because not only is wellbeing complicated, but the population groups we're looking at are complicated as well. And I'll talk at the end about one of the things we tried to do that has been limited is to really understand social diversity and wellbeing inequalities. I don't think we've really made it that far in our project, partly because the reporting on it isn't very good. People are not focusing on wellbeing and inequalities, and that's what we want to influence in research, but also in policy terms. But again, that's just an example of the way that translation can really work well for people. Not something I could never do, but it is really important to have that built into the project. So what have been our key successes? Some of these overlap with what I've just said, but I think the examples that I've given for us demonstrate that we've got this really grounded understanding of wellbeing priorities in the culture and sports sector. We almost need to go back and see if they're still relevant and think about what the priorities are now. And we can probably see how we've influenced some of that evidence building. Certainly our own publications are a development from the kind of knowledge that we've built into our evidence programs. So all of these things that I just showed you, the workshops, the Delphi consultation, the observations with people in the sectors doing delivery, that has all really given us this grounded approach. And I think that's innovative in a large-scale program. It is what qualitative researchers do by definition, but in a large-scale national program, I think that's pretty innovative. From the examples, again, that you've seen just from the images, I think we know now much more about wellbeing in culture and sport than we did at the beginning. And we have much more wellbeing evidence about understanding wellbeing in the UK than we did. We just ran on the 13th of September, the first UK National Conference on Understanding Wellbeing in the UK. And I think that demonstrated how much evidence we do have, which needs to be turned into action in many ways. And that's the link there. You can have a look at that. But I think for me, one of our successes is where we've been able to turn that evidence into impact and to make a difference in whatever area we're trying to do, whether that's evidence building or the well-being of people in their daily lives. I think we've had some key successes there, not perfect, of course. But these briefings have been part of that because they are accessible. and we've got one for each one. Sometimes you get some luck when you're doing these projects. And at the time that we were doing the Sport and Dance project, the UK government released a parliamentary inquiry about the social impact of participation in culture and sport. Brilliant. I think it's the quickest response we've been able to make to anything like this, because we were building the evidence and we had it. And other partners in the sector that we've been working with were able to respond quickly as well, and with good evidence. And I think that has been really valuable, and I think will and has shaped the landscape around policy objectives. There is now Department of Culture, Media, Digital Culture, Media and Sport now have a policy objective on wellbeing that's connected to loneliness. That's been heavily funded for implementation work, and now there's a call out for people to evaluate that. So I think that has been incredibly powerful. There's a little bit of luck in the timing there, but still, nonetheless, really important. Obviously, the secondary analysis, and this is what the case studies look like. So they're a two-page, two-column approach. Let's just go back to that demonstrate what people in the sector are doing. That's just one from sport, but there's others from culture and the arts. And you know, the What Works Wellbeing website has also been central to the dissemination work that we've done. Actually, in our original bid, we did build in a website as part of the project. They're actually not that easy. They sound good, but they're not that easy to develop and host, and they need a lot of time and expertise given to them. And it was great that actually, as the project developed, the centre could take on that role because they have incredible reach across the UK. We can tweet about it, all of that kind of stuff. And we have blogs as well that we try and get in regularly, pioneer blogs for what people are doing. So that impact is broad and diverse, from the academic papers to the social media. And I think it is worth really thinking about doing that and how you do it in these kind of partnership projects. And I've given you some examples from sport, but you know, in terms of impact and influencing what the sectors do, Norma's work has been really powerful here. Again, at a government level or government organisation level, working with Public Health England to develop ways of looking at the quality of the grey literature, but also trying to ensure that people doing evaluations report better, has been really important for Norma's work. And she's run a programme on that. In fact, it's in the next slide. I'll talk about it in a minute. Evidence mobilisation is really hard work, because you really do have to get out and do. It's one thing having an academic conference where you bring academics to you, and that really works. But it's quite another thing going out to people to ensure that you are connecting outwards as well as bringing people in. And I honestly cannot emphasize the importance of that enough, but also demonstrate how difficult it is. So one of our partners is UK Active in the UK. They're a big network promoting physical activity across the UK in all sorts of ways. And again, serendipitously, they held a series of regional workshops just as our work on sport and dance was coming out. But these are three events that I went to that UK Active ran in different parts of the country in the UK. So it really does require this kind of road trip to get the message out. And again, because of our expertise, we built that into our project. Other projects that hadn't thought about it did think that it was really important, but it's a challenge to do it. So the final success really is about informing evidence building in the sectors. I said earlier on, some of this evidence is, even when it's good, it's quite limited. We realised we knew, but it demonstrated that where there was wellbeing work being done, it was very diverse in how things were being measured or evaluated, and how wellbeing was even conceptualised in research. We started to produce these tables in our reports about all the measures that we use for wellbeing, and there's so many of them. Self-esteem, life satisfaction, quality of life, all of these measures are being used as a proxy for wellbeing. And whilst we did have good evidence, it was fairly limited in most of these. And so what we wanted to do through our wider work was inform evidence building in the sectors. And this, again, comes with another kind of work package. Here's one example of a project we've just finished with a group called Street Games in the UK. which are a UK national organisation that delivers community sport for young people in disadvantaged communities. And we worked for a year last year with them, exploring and evaluating their programme and its impact on wellbeing and mental health for young people. And that involved interviews, observations, participant observations, a whole series of research techniques. But we wanted to gain a deeper understanding of the contribution of what they call doorstep sport. It's essentially delivering and implementing community sport very close and in the communities in which people live. But they were really interested in its impact on health and wellbeing. So it dovetailed with what we were doing. We wanted to inform how they evaluated and what the findings would be. And you know, being able to see and to report on some of the issues we were looking at in the evidence reviews around tailoring provision, training the workforce to deliver to mental health outcomes, partnerships for delivery, but also strategies for high quality evaluation was really kind of central to what we wanted to develop from the What Works Centre work. And Norma can talk more expertly about this, but her Creative Incredible programme, it's been a funded programme through the University of Winchester that has been about doing exactly what I've said about the sports sector in the culture and arts sector, and supporting groups who are delivering really high quality programmes to evaluate what they do and demonstrate evidence for what they do. And there are other examples. So when I talk about those, it all sounds like it's really lovely and perfect and we haven't had any issues. But of course there are challenges. It's a long project. I think we've really worked on the things that we knew we needed to in order to achieve the successes I've talked about. But still the challenges remain. And there are three core ones for me. And I think time and timing is really quite central. So I talked about the parliamentary inquiry, and the timing of that was great for us and we could respond really quickly. That quick response, particularly from UK government departments, is always there. You know, we had a request from the HM Treasury, even before we'd started some of these reviews, to send them the evidence on culture, sport and wellbeing within 48 hours. And so being in response mode, as well as being proactive in these situations, is probably what we would advise for ourselves. It's not always easy. And in those moments where you're asked for things at a moment's notice, I think you have to be really confident about your own expertise and what you do know, and getting it out there really, really quickly. Because if you don't do that, I mean, it's often, and we thought, oh, we haven't done anything, what can we say? If you don't respond, policy practice will develop anyway. And there is always something that you have. And when we look back at some of the evidence we already knew from some of the work we'd already done, we could do it. So it is just being aware of being able to be responsive. Because political priorities change really, really quickly. And I think it's really important researchers are in that network, because we do have expertise and we do have the evidence to support the development of those decisions. I talked about going out to practice organisations. That's a necessity for me, because practice and delivery is done in particular contexts at particular times through particular funding mechanisms. And practice professionals just don't have the time or the resources. It's not within their kind of work practices to always keep coming out of those to do what you want them to do. And so I think that kind of comes back to my point about reciprocity. Is really, really important. In all research projects, the expectations, I think, are huge now, particularly around, but particularly in the social sciences and in policy-led evidence programmes. I've just put outputs. You're always producing something, whether it's an academic paper or a case study or a report, or you're responding to a really quick request for information. Again, it's about trying to be agile, I guess. It's not always easy, and I think building your team is really key from the outset. Both multidisciplinary, because people bring different skill sets to all of this, but also you need the wide scope for your particular partnerships, and that's the model that we use. There is always going to be this challenge around academic convention, both in terms of how you write, how you author things, and the kind of political imperatives for the way things are presented. I think recognising that from the outset, and in the UK, we're just coming into the we're in the research excellence framework process. Case studies are going to be a part of that, but we're going to need to evidence that we've made an impact. And so getting our names on briefings or case studies, you know, is going to be part of that. And there's just different conventions that I think we need to work through as partners. And obviously the translation, dissemination, and mobilisation requirements are something that I've talked about. And the other key challenge that I think we need to think about as academics in universities is the multidisciplinary approach, the partnership approach, the internationalisation of that, but also the capacity building of our students, because this is about evidence building, knowledge exchange, all the things that our students from undergraduate through to postgraduate and PhD levels should be aware of and involved in. And so we've thought, particularly at Brunel, quite hard about how we build health and wellbeing into those programs. So I've been quite central in repositioning physical activity, health and wellbeing into our undergraduate program. It's now a core stream through the 3 years. We have a doctoral training program funded by the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK, where we're in partnership with Oxford and the Open University, and we lead a strand on health and wellbeing. And I think that training around methods, evidence building, and the discipline has been really front and centre of our minds. It takes a long time to make that kind of impact, but I think that has to be thought about, and it is a challenge. And my final comment, actually, has been running through the programme right from the start. Our programme was called Culture and Sport, Social Diversity and Context Matters. Our backgrounds in social science, you know, made us cognizant of the real importance of trying to understand wellbeing inequalities, as it has done in all the evidence programmes. But it hasn't been easy to demonstrate evidence around this issue, largely because the evidence base hasn't necessarily reported on it. In the quantitative material, you get a description of demographics. In the qualitative literature, it's limited and, you know, focused on particular aspects of inequality. But I guess I'm going to finish on the fact that I don't think we've gone far enough on this. We need to look more specifically about it in any work that we do in the future. And our own work needs to be informed by it. Professor Jane South, who works in the communities team, was on a panel at our conference, and she put up these two quotes that I think were really, really valuable about making a difference to wellbeing inequalities. And one comes from the Marmot Review in the UK that really emphasised that it's socioeconomic group deprivation that makes a huge impact, probably one of the key impacts to health and wellbeing across the life course. And that issue is something I think we haven't necessarily informed in the way that we would have wanted to. And, you know, her point here about relative deprivation and social injustice, which impacts specifically on emotional, spiritual, intellectual resources, which are about wellbeing, is really central. And I think this has got to be the focus for our future work. So I'm grateful to Jane for really bringing that to our attention. So a number of conclusions. The conceptual clarity that we started out trying to really work on is still there. With every aspect of wellbeing that we talk about, the concepts are difficult. We're now working, we just delivered a project for the UK government on loneliness interventions. And loneliness is a key threat to wellbeing. But in the literature, the conceptual clarity is poor. You know, loneliness is used interchangeably with social isolation, relationships, and we've now suggested that we do a conceptual review of that. Certainly a need for better evidence on wellbeing across the board and the better use of it. Our work to develop evidence building has demonstrated the need to really work with people on the methods that they use and the need to understand wellbeing inequalities, as I've said. I think one of the interesting and really difficult things, and the communities evidence programme has really worked on this, is that we still have individual focus on wellbeing. It's measured individually. The only way we get a sense of what happens in a group is when we aggregate those individual scores. And I think that's something that we can work on. And of course, the strengths and difficulties around developing what I call communities of practice or communities of policy, communities of researchers, is something that's been both a challenge to us but also a key success of what we've done. That's it. You're welcome.
So we've got time for some questions and comments. I don't know if anyone would like to kick it off.
Go for it.
So was this a 3-year grant that you received?
Yeah, yeah.
So now looking back and knowing how long it takes to translate and disseminate knowledge, what are your thoughts on 3 years?
I think, the standard kind of really length of long-term project you're going to get is 3 years. There is future work to be done. I think you can also do some really good work in a shorter time frame. So I'm not so stuck on this not being long enough. I think the length of time depends on what you're trying to do. And in this project, again, because, I think I've been building up to this idea for more than 10 years. And Norma's experience, and everyone on the team, that experience and expertise meant that I think one of the things we did really well was costing the resources to do the partnership work, both in terms of time and money. And I think whilst it's always hard work, and sometimes we felt like we were doing this on a daily basis rather than however much we'd been costed in for, I think we got it just about right in terms of the scope and the numbers of reviews and the outputs that we did. And when you're working in partnership, particularly with government, there is a tendency to say, yes, we can do this, and this. We knew we could not do it all. And I think determining the priorities and setting the boundaries for what we could and couldn't do early on was really beneficial. So whether or not 3 years was enough, probably just right for what we plan to do. There's future work to be done. I think you can do work in a shortest time scale, again, depending on what you want to do.
Another related thing, did you, on the team of people who applied for the grant, did you all know each other? You had worked before? There was
pretty much. There was history. Apart from one, and he won't mind me saying this, but Professor Paul Dolan at the London School of Economics, before this grant, had done most of the work around wellbeing in the culture and sports sectors for government departments. And there was a seminar on when this grant came out and that you went to. And I knew he'd done this work. And my thinking was, if he's going to apply, I'm not quite sure there's any point me applying. And so I emailed him and said, we're going to apply. Do you want to be part of the team? And he said, yes, like in an instant. So I would always be on the side of know your partners. But sometimes you can just get out there and find someone. And actually with Norma wasn't part of the original bid. And we were awarded the grant with a condition that we find an expert in the arts. And I probably haven't talked to you about how much work we did to try and find you, but we did. And that was, just an email, cold call, I guess, around this is what we're doing. We really like to involve you. We need an expert in the arts. And that's how that came about. So yeah, the basic advice from my point of view, and I'd say it to myself, is work with people that you've built up a network with, but also be prepared to try and bring people in. And if you've got a good project, people don't mind being asked and thinking about being involved. Yeah. You had a question, then I come.
Yeah, thanks. So could you say something more about the criteria and also the process by which you evaluate the
Yeah. So first and foremost, grey literature is essential in the work that we do because there's so much of it and some of it's really good, and you won't find it by searching through the usual databases. The criteria that we've used is drawn from Norma's work with Public Health England, and it involves looking at the quality of the method. So how good does the research question relate to the methods that used? And it involves, within that method, some attention to ethics. And then it also involves the quality of how things have been reported. Has a theory underpinned the analysis? Is there connection to what they're doing in the wider practice space? We've got a form, actually, that we use. So those criteria, and then we fill them in. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, the process of gathering the evidence was interesting because we didn't actually go out and look for the grey literature ourselves because it's such a problematic process. We didn't do that to an extent, but the did a call for evidence. So on what works sense for wellbeing, very important call for evidence. He invited people to submit great literature. So we had what would come up in our searches, but that's always limited because if it's not in the academic world, some things are just not visible. And those calls for evidence produced a large amount of literature. I think in terms of the public health framework, one of the things I've learned from working with a lot of projects and communities is that people feel under pressure to produce evidence of impact and outcome, but they don't know how to measure it, they don't know anything about the methodologies really, or they try and apply methodologies inappropriately, so they'll try and apply a kind of randomised control model or some other kind of quantitative model to a very small project where they don't really understand the outcomes, and they haven't done, they're not at that stage. So the Public Health England work is really designed to bring people on along the journey. And the starting point is good project descriptions. Because if you can't even describe your project, how is a commissioner going to know whether that's more or less beneficial than something else? So if it's music, tell us what it is. How much music, what people are actually doing, who's delivering it, what resources do you need to deliver it, what are the outcomes, why is it different from gardening or law? And I think there's a lot of unconscious, people assume that other people understand what they're doing because they're so immersed in it themselves, and they haven't really learned to kind of report it in a way which is friendly to commissioners and the commissioning process. So a lot of my work has been about bridging commissioning with practice at a very kind of local level. And then looking at quality criteria, it's really about, quite often, the ethics is really important. In the qualitative work, is there an analysis process? Because often what you get is just face value reporting of what participants say, and it's full of bias because people will say what if you're evaluating a project and people know you as part of that project, they're going to tell you what you want to hear. So trying to bring a more critical awareness to this whole area, recognising that arts and culture are very beneficial. We'd all like to believe that there are kind of benefits of that, but actually they're part of society, so they have a critical edge. They can have diminishing outcomes, they can have negative outcomes, they can reproduce inequalities, they often do. So it's really important to have a kind of critical awareness of what can go well in the project, but also what the unintended outcomes of that project might be in a more sort of critical narrative. I think that's part of our kind of quality criteria. I think it's the reflexivity there.
So I think the criteria are different to how we're judging the published peer-reviewed literature. They're broader in scope. They're a little bit, that they allow for much more difference. But we think they also stop us including work that really is not high quality because it doesn't report properly. And so we cannot say that we can commit that to an evidence base. And I think that probably does exclude some quite good work, but it has to be reported in some way. And of course, then the question is, well, how would you judge a performance piece, for example? We've never had to do it yet, or a piece of poetry. We haven't done it, but I think that debate has to be part of how you judge the quality.
And that's an area of work that's developing in this field in terms of Arts Council England, and published a kind of a matrix and a methodology for assessing artistic quality, and that's a really interesting area. How that aligns with outcomes and impacts. Because for me, it's a kind of quite a critical mediating factor because of the processes of high quality, or people don't perceive it as such, so they don't engage with it.
I think you were next, and then
Thank you.
Okay.
In Finland, we have this discussion about wellbeing, but in a different way.
Yeah.
It's very interesting why, what's the reason for that?
Yeah.
It's another story.
Yeah.
I think one reason is because we used to have welfare society.
Yeah.
That is another story. important. But then my question, actually, it's about rights. My mind this concept of inclusion, exclusion, social population. What kind of relationship you see between well-being and these three concepts?
This was something that was very much talked about with in our original workshop. So people working with people in the range of sectors talked about well-being in terms of broadly social relations, whether that was feeling included or excluded or marginalised, or feeling a sense of togetherness and the meaning and the identity that comes from that. That actually for me is a central core concept, largely from my sociological work, that I think needs to be focused on more specifically. It's kind of there in the Office of National Statistics measure, in the idea of worthwhileness. But I think theoretically, it is about meaning and identity. And with that comes the notion of being an insider or an outsider and how those relationships work. The communities team very much focused on this idea of social connectedness and relationships and the impact that has on well-being. And of course, loneliness, which is something we're working on at the moment, is connected to the relationships that you have. So in terms of its importance, I think it's centrally important to understanding the well-being of people, the relationships that they have, what that means to them, how easy and difficult they are, and the whole notion of identifying with people or not, I think is crucial to the idea of well-being and well-being inequalities. It shapes the well-being inequalities, I think. I mean, the structural processes of deprivation are really key to that, and that's a welfare issue. But as people, the social relationships that we have, the bonds we make, the identification and meaning that we get from that, I think it's key to understanding well-being. Yeah. That's kind of underpins our next project. And it would be for me now, applying for other funds, I would be focusing on that. And one of the things that has been a criticism of our work and across the centre is that we haven't done enough on critical work on the notion of well-being and well-being measures. I mean, again, 3 years, how much can you do in 3 years? But I think what's good about that comment, although it's critical, is that it does open up the doors for bringing different theories and perspectives to the well-being agenda, and I think that's really important. Yeah.
My apologies for coming late.
No, that's fine.
Appointments committee.
Are you Rebecca?
Yes.
Hello.
Yes. So I've been following this through Norma's grant activities quite interestedly. I must admit to know virtually nothing about well-being other than what I've learned through Norma, but my interest in the way in which you work is broader in that I've got a particular interest in a particular brief here to encourage colleagues in terms of their professional practice, in terms of undertaking the sorts of research and the sorts of engagement. I try not to use the word impact because I come from Britain and it has such bad resonances for me. Because that's becoming an imperative here, and I'm also kind of quite ideologically committed to the idea that this is an important social obligation to the people who pay our salaries, ultimately, the ordinary people. And I'm sitting here betting. I bet you're an impact case study at Brunel. Yes, there you go. But beyond that kind of performative stuff that academics in the UK go through, I wonder if you could expand a bit on just sort of what it's like for you as a researcher moving into this kind of space in this kind of ways, and whether you find it enhances or diminishes your prestige and standing as a researcher, how people react to it, what kind of enjoyment or satisfaction you get out of it.
To some extent, the whole impact thing is a no-brainer for me, because that's been central to the work. I think it is for a whole range of social scientists from the moment they start doing their work. It's about engaging with the people and communities that you're interested in. It's about wanting to make a difference. It's about understanding things through the eyes of those people. So that method of working has been in my DNA, I guess, from the moment I started this work. So when you then, and it's been probably undervalued actually until this kind of project comes along. And so this particular call was something that I, relished, because it was an ability to demonstrate, what, this is what we do. And the whole notion of impact case studies, that people are sort of running around going, God, how do you demonstrate impact? I know, and you're thinking, yes, this is really important, and we've been sort of saying this is really important for a really, really long time. So there's an enhancing feature more broadly with other academic colleagues that don't work in this way. It's also a way to bring along professional practitioners and to value their expertise. I think this turns on its head the notion of who's an expert and who's a specialist, because that's context specific. And it's been a joy to really bring all of those into the mix. I think policymakers at a government level, that impact is central to what they do as well, only it's done in a particular way. And they've been very much open to the partnership work. It's their way of working is different because they have to do things so quickly. And that's been a challenge. So enhancing as professionally and personally for me, because it's brought value, I think, to the work that we've done. Challenging because you still get the issues around whether or not that's proper research, doing this kind of work. We still get that, despite the ref impact case studies and the income generation and the publications. And there's still establishment views about what counts as research, what counts as evidence. But I think that's a battle social scientists have been fighting for a really long time. And again, I think this project and the profile of it has been professionally and personally enhancing. Difficult. It's taken over, I would have to say it's taken over our lives at some points.
And our systematic review nightclub, didn't
it? Yeah. But again, it comes down to your point, what can you possibly do in 3 years? What I think not over promising is the answer, because these things will always develop into more than you said they were going to be. And I think you have to be responsive to that.
Have you actually considered writing something about kind of your professional practice around this? Because I think there's really valuable stuff in there, valuable experiences for a lot of academics, in terms of the way we conduct research, what counts as research, how you do it. So something really. I
think you're absolutely right. I said to Norma as we were walking along here, you sort of, as academics these days, you go from one thing to the next, I said, we just need some time to reflect. This notion of reflexivity in partnerships, that's not this kind of navel-gazing reflexivity. You need to structure reflexivity in to think about that sort of thing. I think you're absolutely right. I presented a paper at a conference a couple of years ago now called Compromised ? And it was about that kind of some of the challenges we're talking about here, and the ways of working, and how positive that can be, but also how challenging, and lessons to be learned for people getting into it. So I think you're right. A
lot of really valuable expertise in for all sorts of other areas.
And I also think just perhaps encouraging some resilience in colleagues, as much as I get a bit nervous about that word resilience, because it sounds as if you've got to cope with everything. But I think even knowing that this stuff is really hard, and you're going to get the knockbacks. And we applied for a 3-year additional funding project, went through all the applications and the interviews, then had to provide more information, and it was decided that it wasn't going to be awarded, but that we could have a chance to reapply for a 1-year one. But that's a reapplication and a recosting, and all this takes. I'm happy to do it, but I think that it's not well known about how much effort that takes, particularly when you're recosting with a range of partners from different universities.
But so, in addition to that, though, if you think about scholars who are sort of junior in their careers, we're pretty established.
We are, but within this, we have also appointed research assistants throughout the project, and talking about that capacity building. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So we've trained them in the methods, we've brought them into the partnerships. That has been about capacity building. And there have also been early career researcher colleagues who've wanted to be involved and have been involved and not been funded to do it, but they have been on, they're on some of the publications. And so, but we have to be conscious of not using that labour for free, I think. It's about, focus on whether the topic is relevant for their career strategy. A lot of this has been about people wanting to know about the methods of systematic review. And so we've had workshops and training for that. And then that has led to some of these other funded projects we've got, like the Street Games project. I was then able to bring in an early career researcher who'd done a bit of work on this project to learn how to write the bid, cost it, and so on and so forth, and to help him understand the wellbeing context and the connections to health. So I think you're absolutely right, yes, and we've had research assistants on these projects, which that has been a key feature. Yeah.
Well, if there are no more questions and comments, I'd like to thank Louise.
Thank you.
All the way.
Thank you.